consider buying a Stars and Stripes Freedom deck to support my educational series. Available from La Loteria Loca. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a free speech advocate who was originally born in Somalia. Due to Muslim traditions, she was subjected to female genital mutilation and was forced to marry a distant cousin. She managed to escape the oppressive Islamic dictate before joining her spouse in Canada by an application of asylum to the Netherlands. She has since become an activist for women's rights and was a member of the Dutch Parliament from 2003 to 2006. Currently, she is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and the founder of the AHA Foundation. She speaks on today's issues and offers a platform to exchange perspectives that lead to real solutions. This upcoming audio presentation is from an interview she was in with the Daily Wire host Ben Shapiro, which I used in my recent series covering Manning Johnson's book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense. If you have not yet seen that series, the episodes will be linked in the description.
So, radical Islam and terrorist attacks that take place or that are plotted are unfolding in a context within Western society where there is a great deal of moral relativism. We're in the midst of these culture wars where on one side identity politics prevails. And according to the dictates of identity politics, multiculturalism, moral relativism, the West is held responsible for past sins, from slavery to colonialism to the Holocaust. And the story of Western civilization is told only from that perspective. Just a series of terrible things, heinous offenses against humanity that Western civilization committed. The other side of the story, all the good things that the West has done, that is not told or it is suppressed. And in that context, it becomes, you open the door for exploitation. And the radical Islamists who are pushing their political agenda through peaceful means called da'wah or through violence called jihad, they exploit that opening. And by the way, it's not just the radical Islamists. Both China and Russia and other adversaries are happy to exploit that sort of thing. I don't think that radical Islamic doctrine or its agenda is capable of defeating Western society. It's just militarily, economically not capable of doing that. But if the West implodes, that's going to come from the inside. We don't challenge where these two movements, these two ideologies, where they part ways. So they have a lot of things in common. The identitarians, these days we call them woke. So the woke despise anyone who disagrees with them. They're committed to their orthodoxy. They use that same playbook of smearing people's characters, committing character assassination, and doing anything they can, absolutely, to shut down debate. And their political agenda in many ways is similar to that of the radical Islamists because they want to bring the house down. They complain that there is structural racism and structural injustice, and the only way to correct those injustices is by bringing down the master's house. And that is a commitment that they share with the radical Islamists. So you can see where they come together and work together. But very few people have taken the opportunity to actually challenge them on those issues because radical Islamists, as you know, see women as inferior. I don't think they've even recognized that there's such a thing as transgender. And then in many Muslim countries, and according to radical Islamists, homosexuals, LGBT people, actually, that's a capital offense and they should be killed or imprisoned. And so no one has really taken them, the Islamists and the identity politics people, and put them in a place that makes it very clear to them, those two groups, that there is some things they have in common, but there are some pretty major things that they don't. I've seen a few incidents, for instance, in the United Kingdom, in some elementary or high school situations where sex education is recommended or demanded by these schools, and then the Islamists come in and shut that down, or where they try to make a case for tolerance towards LGBT communities, and the Islamists come and they shut that down. So I've seen incidents like that, and obviously I think you're familiar with the history of Iran, where a leftist movement was very happy with overthrowing the Shah, but they didn't expect the Islamists to take control. And when the Islamists took control of government, they obviously suppressed and shut down the leftists, threw them in prison and executed them. And so for the moment, I think in that relationship or so-called alliance between the far left and the Islamists see the far left as useful idiots, which they are and have been for a long time. Well, the movement to curtail free speech is alive and well, and it's been growing. And again, the Islamists have been exploiting it, bringing in the word Islamophobia and lobbying for all sorts of legislation against so-called hate crimes. And that's just an attempt to shut up decent and serious debate on these issues. But if you look at the situation in France, so for decades we were told, don't talk about these issues because it's going to empower the far right. Well, the far right is empowered. Marine Le Pen's Front National Party is now the second largest party. And according to the polls, in the previous election, there was a chance that she could have won the presidency. And in the coming elections of next year, there is again an even bigger chance that she can win those elections and become the president of France. So the argument that the extreme right wing is going to grow is just false, or only grows if you put a taboo on these issues. Aside from that, the current president, who is, I would say, squarely in the center, has said that we have a very big problem in France where a large number of the population is separating itself from the rest of France, led by radical Islamists to reject all things French, the laws, the norms, the values. And a problem that, in my view, about 30 years ago was smallish and could have been prevented is now this entrenched issue where even though they are passing legislation to mitigate that separatism, abolishing homeschooling, demanding all sorts of things to ensure that separatism, that these ghettos don't break away, it's still, in my view, too little too late. But it makes the argument that making things taboo and legislating hate speech is not going to take the problem away. I think it is very concerning, maybe even alarming, that in the United States and across Western society, we have a growing group of people who subscribe to this ideology of critical race theory. Again, I think the general public just calls it woke because that's what they call themselves. But in this ideology, yes, it's all about feelings. It's about subjectivity. There is no universal truth. And like we spoke about earlier, they do hate America and Western civilization, not just the terrible things that we did in the past, but even the good things. We're all racists, we're Islamophobes, we're transphobes, we're this phobic and that phobic. There's a rejection by the people who subscribe to this ideology of having any kind of objective truth where we can agree on what exactly racism is so that we can all fight it, or what exactly, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, what these things are so that we can fight it. There is a corruption of language. There is a corruption of the curriculum of middle school, high school, colleges. And I don't think this is going to end well if we carry on this way, because in my view, that is how the closing of minds takes place. We're basically closing the minds of young people. People now in college, and the reason why they don't want me to come and speak in some of these colleges, or the reason why they don't want you to go and speak in these colleges, is because you're going to violate their safe spaces. We are accused of microaggressions. I've been doing this book promotion that is really about women's rights, and women's magazines won't have me because some of their employees might not feel safe. So it's getting pretty ridiculous. And I think 4 or 5 years ago, I used to laugh it off. And now watching people being canceled, people losing their livelihoods, people in academic life saying, I wanted to do research on this topic, but I don't think I'm going to do it anymore because I don't want to deal with the trouble that's going to cause me. So this is now getting not just into free speech, it's getting into academic freedom. It is a hostility to science. It's a hostility to the Constitution, which we all think is, in my view, the best document ever devised, best political document ever devised. So I'm more than concerned. I think it's alarming. And I hope that people now wake up and understand that it's not just something that you can let it just happen. It's a fad. It's going to blow. It won't. It's getting worse and worse. And I think if young people growing up in America or in any other Western society, if they feel that their societies are unjust and terrible places to live in, I think the best program would be for them to spend some time in other countries where life is different. accept. So some of the women who say, oh my gosh, it's terrible to be a woman in the United States, I would say, spend a few months in Afghanistan or in any country in the Middle East, try and take some time off and go to various parts of Africa, and let's see what you come back with, and then report back. And I think if it were an integrated part of the college curriculum or a gap year after you leave high school, I think people would come back really sober and appreciative of what they have. And, we've got to improve on the situation in America. We have inequality, we have injustices, we have racism, we have all of these problems. None of us are denying that. It's just that, A, the answer is not to destroy the entire framework and the entire structure of American society. And B, there are ways of doing it within the system. There are ways of trying to achieve improvements within the system we have, rather than argue and advocate for the complete destruction of what we have. Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, they are absolutely not interested in debate. They're not interested in discussion. In my view, they are not even interested in ending racism because they refuse to define it. Ibram Kendi goes from refining it as something that affects people to no, it's not about people. He said, it's about policies. And then you have this jump from one to the other. Again, this corruption of language, this circular reasoning. You are white, therefore you are racist. If you say I'm not, then you are suffering from white fragility. And so round and round we go. And that has a cult-like quality to it. And it also has a cult-like following to it. And if I look at some of the people who are animated by this, these are middle-class, young white people. Mostly young white people. There are not many Hispanics or African Americans or other immigrants from other parts of the world who are drawn to this cult and woke ideology. I'm not an expert. I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but someone really needs to try and explain why this is the case. I've tried to look at Black Lives Matter as an organization, as a movement. I've been on their website, just curious, because in the summer we had the killing of George Floyd, a terrible incident. And I go on their website and I don't find anything on that website and in their message that I would say would improve the lives of Black people right now. There are things in there such as the abolition of the nuclear family. Now, if you really care about the African American community, one thing you would not do would be to suggest that the nuclear family be abolished. Because one of the huge problems we have is these absent fathers, teenage pregnancies. There is that type of social blight where the first step would be actually to advocate for the nuclear family. They're advocating for reparations. This is so cosmic and abstract. It's not something that an African-American kid in Texas or in Chicago or in New York is going to feel like that changes my situation right now. They're against charter schools. They're against the police. They want to defund the police. So you have to ask yourself, why is this huge contradiction? If they really, really care about Black people, then why are they advocating for all the things that would ruin Black families and Black communities? The answer is they're not interested in Black communities. They're interested in getting to power by exploiting vulnerable communities like Blacks, like transgender communities, like women, and so on and so forth. So these are not people, it's not an ideology or a cult that's interested in justice or bringing about justice. It's only for them to get power. That's exactly why I used the word alarming, and why I said a few years ago we were all amused by it, and now it's not amusing, it's alarming. Yes, there is it's a small group, but it is intransigent, they're determined, and they've frightened most other people into silence or acquiescence or just looking away and pretending there's nothing going on while they take control of institutions. And that is why I said it's alarming. That's precisely what we've seen in societies that were infiltrated by such tiny groups, such as radical Islamists. When I talk to some of my Arab friends, they say, things were more modern and more liberal and more relaxed and more tolerant in the 50s and 1960s and in the 70s than they are today. And that is because that small minority of Islamists, incredibly determined, were able to get what they wanted and take over institutions because they were able to frighten the masses, they were able to frighten the middle classes, they were able to frighten corporations and leaders into either towing their line or staying silent and letting things happen. And that's exactly why I use the word alarming. Even though these woke people, the language they use, the demands that they make are outrageous, they're ridiculous, and sometimes we think they're funny, but it's not funny. And I think it's time we actually wake up. All of us who really understand what the woke ideology is about also understand that they don't care. The woke do not care whether you are center-left or center-right. They want to bring the entire structure down. Now, it's also true that this woke ideology has come out of the left side of things. And so, number one, I think it's people on the left, I call them the sane left or the liberal left. They have to wake up to the fact that the Democratic Party, but also other liberal institutions, have made themselves vulnerable toward this toxic ideology of wokeism. On the conservative side, I think that it's not enough to be apathetic and say, well, that's happening to them, it's not happening to me. It's happening to all of us. So it is an alliance we all have to form. I think for a long time, at least since 1945, we truly understand what white supremacy and far-right ideologies mean and what they can lead to. And it's a message that we need to continue to propagate, teach younger generations. Don't be lured, don't be seduced by the ideology of white supremacists and the far right. But we've paid very, very little attention to some of the far left ideology or ideologies that were cropping up there, because we've always thought that whatever comes off the left is something that can be excused or tolerated, or it's just a fringe. People will get over it. It's romantic. And it just isn't. And now we're being confronted with this 1984 type Orwellian dystopia that they're chasing, and that in some communities, it seems as if they've achieved those things. I think the saying, that if you want to preserve liberty, it's an eternal struggle. It is something that you have to be aware of all the time. That holds true to this day. And whether a society is secular or not, if a society is free, and if the fundamental principle of that society is based on freedom, on liberty, then the assumption is that that eternal vigilance is warranted. I think bad ideas and bad ideologies are just part of being human. We were dealing with radical Islamic ideology and still are to a certain extent. And then comes this woke ideology that is sort of recycled Marxism or neo-Marxism, which we're familiar with. Is it easier for these ideologies, especially the quasi-religious types of things, to emerge and find a foothold in secular societies? I think the answer to that is true, that if you have your own religion, Judaism or Christianity or whatever, you have your own belief community, it becomes difficult for other people to seduce you with ideologies. You think, I've already got a religion, I don't need your religion. You also, if you, I think, come out of a religious background, as I do, you recognize a religion when you see it. A cult and that cultish characteristics of the woke. I think anybody who's grown up in any serious religion can see that this is a quasi-religious thing. But I'm very careful, because I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do listen to both sides. I want to be very careful that I don't say, oh, the solution to the problem we're having right now is because we've drifted away from religion, we have to go back to religions. I think that's, first of all, not possible, but even if it were possible, I think wokeism and other bad ideologies will emerge anyway. And so I prefer to go back to that truism that if you want to preserve a liberal society, you do have to do it with it's constant vigilance. You just can't get complacent, unfortunately. We have seen a backlash here. I think what led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was a backlash against, at the time, I don't remember, we used the word wokeism, but the prevailing phrase was political correctness. So if we feel like we can't speak, we can't say what we need to say, and we're called deplorables and looked down upon, then people will vote with their feet. They leave the parties that are calling them these names. One thing that gives me hope is the emergence of podcasts. All of these market-driven ways of exchanging information that established organizations refuse to publish. So instead of me having to call the New York Times all the time, can you please publish this op-ed? Now we're starting our own podcasts, our own newsletters. We're blogging. We are communicating with one another using the market forces to communicate information and opinion that is censored away from other places. I hope that is the true backlash. And I've heard and read about people who are saying maybe podcasts should also be stopped or controlled or restrained, or, let's be aware of that and let's push back against that. Freedom needs constant vigilance. It also needs constant protection of the freedom of speech, the freedom to exchange ideas without fear. And here we are. I mean, we are not on any of the big, powerful broadcasting corporations. You've got your own thing, and I've started my own thing, and all the people we know, they've started their own thing. And I think there lies, at least in terms of increasing the awareness of problems, I think there we have a solution and a proper backlash.
Thanks for tuning in. Please consider supporting my series and buying a deck of cards from my store La Loteria Loca.